So existe o silêncio, este momento, nenhuma palavra precisa de contar. Sorriso de você, sorriso de...
Welcome to the Super Gamer Podcast. Welcome to the new Super Gamer Podcast, episode 141. Our guest this week is a musician, a composer, arranger, producer, DJ, guitarist, tin whistler, pianist, banjo player, boron player, mandolin player, dulcimer player? I don't know how to pronounce that one, but a multi-instrumentalist. We have Ian Martyn here. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
You also go by, I don't know if you still do, but Balar for chiptune?
Yeah, so I played around with chiptune back in the day. And by back in the day, I mean like 12 years ago. And a friend at the time had suggested that I use a different name for that. And that was actually before I got into the VGM scene, like for real. So I just kind of came up with that on my own. But yeah, I mean, if I release chiptunes, which hasn't happened in a long time, it would be under that name. But otherwise, just Ian Martyn for releases and stuff.
Yeah, you had a chiptune album of Bach pieces.
Yeah. I just, was having fun with that. I was inspired. Oh God, I can't remember his name now, but he did some Debussy and I believe there's some Bach on there. There may be even there may be a CPE Bach on there, but there's some Schoenberg and just kind of a variety album of classical music in chiptune. So I kind of decided to do that, but more Bach focused. I actually grew up with the music of Wendy Carlos, who's famous for being one of the first, if not, I think she may have been the first person, or if not the first, then one of the first people to record an album of synthesizer music and became famous for her arrangements of Bach pieces for a very early Moog synthesizer. She worked closely with Robert Moog, who's one of the very first synthesizer inventors and developers. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that she is the one who is also responsible for the keyboard as the main input device for the synthesizer, which in turn helped Moog's devices pull out ahead of, I don't know if you've heard the name Don Buchla, but he was also a very early pioneering synthesizer maker and inventor. But because of what I understand is that because Wendy Carlos had suggested to Bob Moog that he use the keyboard as an input device, that kind of helped the Moog gain traction because it was an input method that was kind of more familiar to, other musicians rather than like a strip or something where you'd have to learn a new input method. Sorry, I went off on a huge tangent there.
No, that's all right. It leads to, people may have figured out at this point, you have a BA in music history and an MA in ethnomusicology.
Yeah, so my BA, I double majored in linguistics and anthropology. But I minored in music history, and then for my MA I did in ethnomusicology, and so that was fun. I unfortunately did not focus on the history of the synthesizer or synthesizer music, but maybe I should have, right?
Well, I'm interested how as you said, well, obviously you've been into music for decades, like since you were quite young, but you got into video game music, specifically the scene, I think you've said before, 2015. I'm interested how, like, chiptune seems pretty adjacent to the video game scene. Like, how does one get into chiptune and not so much into the video game scene?
So I had recently started my master's program at UC Davis and connected with a group of people who became close friends of mine who were living in the South Bay area of the Bay Area, like San Jose, Santa Clara, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, that sort of area. I don't know how familiar you are with California, but it's kind of like a tech hub, right? Or what people would call Silicon Valley. And those people were familiar with chiptune. And I had, of course, heard bands like Anamanaguchi and Slime Girls and stuff like that. And of course, I've been listening to video game music most of my life. So I'm aware of like the technology, but I didn't really realize that there was a chiptune scene. But it didn't really focus on video game music and video game arrangements. It was more about like taking the NES hardware or the Game Boy hardware or some sort of emulator and producing original music with it. So most of the groups that I saw and interacted with live were more kind of along those lines than the sort of video game music arrangement thing. So I kind of dabbled in that. I went to a lot of 8-bit SF shows, and 8-bit SF was like it still is kind of chiptune. I don't know what to call it. I don't know if I should call it like a collective or just a show series. I don't know what to call it, but they would have like monthly meetups where they'd kind of do like a chiptune open mic and usually have like a couple of bands come and play, like chiptune bands, right? Or chiptune musicians would come and play. So I would go to those shows. Those were all in San Francisco. And so it was pretty easy for me to drive out from Davis, stay with friends in the South Bay, and then we'd go up to San Francisco together and like see that stuff. But I just never really got into video game music, like that scene specifically. And I don't know if there was much of a scene for video game music in the Bay Area at that time. We're talking like 2010, 2011, 2012. There are a few bands now who are up there, but Super Soul Brothers, Birthday, those sorts of groups. I don't know how active or prolific they were back when I was there. So I think I just never really connected, or was really aware of the scene at all, to be totally honest, which is unfortunate, but I'm glad I found it when I did.
Yeah, well, I did want to ask actually about, you grew up in LA, which obviously you'd associate as Hollywood, right? A movie city. But like, what about, growing up in that, I assume it's sort of in your face, like it's got to shape sort of how you feel about the entertainment industry. What about games? Were they sort of in your face while being in LA?
Well, I don't think being in LA pushed games at me as hard. But because of where I grew up, and stuff, I was able to connect more closely with Japanese things and Japanese imports specifically. And I think that sort of, for me, fueled sort of the in-your-faceness of video games. So I'm half Japanese American on my mom's side. And so I would go to things like, Japanese malls, which there are several of in the Los Angeles area, and, Japanese bookstores, Japanese CD stores. And there was actually a Japanese used video game store that kind of dealt in specifically like Japanese import video games that were used. So I had access to all of these things. I could walk into a store and buy, the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack or something like that. So I really think even more so than the games, which, the games you could get at sort of any retail outlet, like I'm having a hard time remembering right now, but I think I got games like Toys R Us or something like that, right? But because of all of this others, because I could get all of the supplemental stuff, I could get the art books, like the Japanese exclusive art books, or the CD, the soundtracks that were only released in Japan. And all of that, I think having that access really boosted my interest in video game music, and just kind of video games early on, just because I had access to all of the supplemental things. Where if I did, if I lived somewhere else, right, that didn't have that access, I probably wouldn't have, I certainly wouldn't have been able to buy the the soundtrack albums and listen to them, and all of the arrange albums there are some great Final Fantasy arrange albums that came out in the 90s that I played to death. Like, I just had those on repeat and just cycled through them. I'm sure my parents are incredibly sick of them now. But yeah, I think that was really the thing about growing up in LA. And it wasn't so much the entertainment industry that pushed that, but rather sort of the multicultural aspect, the fact that so many different people from different countries had moved here, including like a Japanese population, and not only the earlier Japanese American population that my family is a part of, but also recent people, people who were born in Japan and came here as adults. And I think just having all of that Japanese stuff around just really made it easy for me to obtain all of these supplemental items that really boosted my excitement for it, and also boosted my friends' excitement for these things.
I was going to ask,
well.
Were you kind of the cool kid then? Like, your friends would be like, oh, I got FF3, and you're like, well, I have all these albums. They must have been like, what?
Yeah, well, we would, my parents were always very nice about this kind of stuff, and, always supported my interest, which I'm eternally grateful for. But they would actually, I grew up in West LA. If you're familiar with Brentwood, that's where I'm from. And most of my friends were also from sort of the general West LA area. But, all as I was growing up and through my teens, right before I got a driver's license, my parents would, drive me and my friends out to these, these Japanese malls or whatever, like Mitsuwa or stuff. There's Asahiya, which was a bookstore, Kinokuniya, which is another bookstore chain, but they had a lot of CDs there. And so we would go there, me and my friends, and we'd pick up all of these CDs and just, and then come back home and listen to them, right? And we all had various opinions on them. But it was definitely nice of my parents to do that. So it wasn't so much like I was the cool kid with all of the stuff, but more that my parents were the cool parents who were willing to give all of these other kids access to that kind of stuff. And, I can imagine it would have been a little harder if you weren't in that community, right? Because I was born in 1986. And a lot of my, the main bulk of my video game music buying and really video game playing happened in the 90s. So pre-internet, you can't just now I can just go on to CD Japan and order whatever I want, right? I can get the entirety of all of the Final Fantasy albums delivered to my door in 2 weeks straight from Japan. But, if you didn't know about those sorts of things back in the 90s before the internet, there was no real way to do that. So in a way, having that family connection through my mom and, my aunt and grandma and stuff, going to these shops and spending time there and just going to the market, right? Going to the Japanese market. Well, if you go to the Japanese market, there's the bookstore on the side with the CDs. So, you're just kind of thrown into that. So what I guess is sort of kind of an everyday mundane experience of we're just going to go to the grocery market, right, is an experience where that sort of, the video game items are presented to me. So I think that really kind of, boosted my interest, and also like my friends too, because who doesn't like Japanese food? Well, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't, but at least for my friends and I, like, we love Japanese food as well. So, you can go there, eat in the food court and like hang out, and that was fun. And then go and like browse the books and the CDs and stuff,
So I'm also born in '86, and
cool.
At the risk of being the old man that I am, I agree that like there's obviously probably more good to the idea that like, well, now you can order what you want, and there's you just go on the internet, do whatever you want, right? But it's kind of unfortunate to me that no one will ever know again what it's like to not know something, or to just not have access to something. And that sounds weird maybe, but like the Nintendo hotline, for example, like the idea that you may just not know how to beat a game, and you could actually phone someone like who worked for Nintendo and be like, what do I do here? And they would tell you. And that was like your only way of doing it. It's just, there's something cool about that.
There was, I remember specifically, I only called it once. Just because I really wanted to try it. And I was playing Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, if you remember that game. Or if you've heard of that one.
I've heard of it. I haven't played it.
Yeah, there are a lot of puzzles, and there are a couple that are like of the invisible maze types, right? Where you can't see the borders of the maze, so you're just moving around and you have to kind of remember it. And I was probably like a 7 or 8 at this point. And I was just stuck, right? But I like really wanted to. I loved the concept of the like 900 number growing up, because it just seemed so ridiculous, or like intrigued me. And I never called them, so that was like my opportunity to like do that and not feel like I was just like doing something I wasn't interested in, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was like a weird joy
like
of not knowing something. And then like, if you happen to learn it somehow, it's like, wow.
Yeah, I remember too, I went to a couple of summer camps with friends. I went to like a rocketry camp with friends, and people, I think I was a little older. I think it was like 10. And we were passing around, like Game Genie cheat codes, right? That were like, we hand wrote them on pieces of paper and copied them and then gave them to each other, for right. And that's another thing, I think, like that sort of the not knowing, and then you kind of discover it, or you have like the connection, right? Like somebody knows a few things and other things, so then you like trade that knowledge.
Right. Like Mortal Kombat finishers were like currency.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, finding all of the like hidden moves, hidden button combos that aren't just like advertised, and then it, and then your friends are like, wow, how did you do that? And then you tell them, and then they tell you something else for some other game, right? It's like that that exchange of information, as opposed to now where you just look it up, right? And it's there. But yeah, no, it's very fascinating. But I do agree that, like, especially with the buying things concept, like e-commerce and stuff, it's so much more convenient. Like, I couldn't even imagine growing up someplace where I didn't have access to those soundtracks, or the arranged albums. Like, what would I, I would have had a totally different life at this point.
You have, in fact, said before, I don't think it was that long ago, but I could be wrong, you were inspired to start VGM covers because of the Final Fantasy Arrange albums. And when I read that, I was psyched, because the Terra prayer version is my all-time, never will be beat best video game song. I love that song.
Yeah, those two. So, like, Pray and Love Will Grow are, like, still two of my absolute favorite Arrange albums, because I love singing. I love vocal VGM. I love taking something that doesn't have lyrics and putting lyrics in it, And that, like, those two albums, I think, were probably one of the first examples of those. I'm not sure. There's that Mother album that came out with Pollyanna and such, and I'm not sure if that was earlier, but I feel like Pray and Love Will Grow were very early examples of that. And I think those two albums, more than any of the other albums, have really shaped how I think about video game music and how I approach arrangements today. And still, obviously, like you said, Terra's theme is excellent with those vocals. I'm trying to think. I remember the Toza's theme from Final Fantasy III is in there too, and I absolutely love that. It's just so many. And Love Will Grow, like the final, I think it's the second to last track on Love Will Grow, but it just every time it's just amazing. But yeah, I can't get enough of those albums. And I just feel like there was so much, going just on the tangent of like 90s video game music arrangement albums. I feel like there was so much variety in what was coming out at that time. Like Final Fantasy IV Celtic Moon, Final Fantasy V Dear Friends, which focused on like Karelia and Finland, and Final Fantasy VI Grand Finale, which was like the big orchestral one. And then you had like, Brink of Time from Chrono Trigger, the acid jazz. This is like the first jazz album I think I ever listened to, right? Was Chrono Trigger, Brink of Time. And I hadn't really considered jazz before that point, but it really like woke me up to, I was like, this is wild. This is awesome. And I just never thought of it before until I heard that album. Right. So I feel like those albums really kind of opened me up to a world of musical discovery that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Just, like video games is a gateway drug or something. I don't know. But that really also kind of sparked an interest in like different musical styles and the concept of like arranging. Like, you don't have to play it note for note. There's nothing wrong. I love note for note arrangements. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there is, but I just love the concept of being able to take something and spin it into it's something that becomes its own world. Right. And I think those albums from the 90s really capture that spirit of like, we're going to take this melody and it's just going to take on a whole new life in this like completely different way. But yeah, sorry, I've gone off on a huge tangent with that.
People are here to hear you, not me. You've done the VGM community is very collaborative. You've done lots of collaboration, and as you know, because I have come to you asking, what do you know about this person before? So I have done this for you, and I'll butter you up a bit. The person I asked, what do you know about Ian? They said, Ian is such a jovial and kind ray of light in a world of goblin men. He's a hell of a musician, arranger, and human being. So there you go. That's very nice.
Oh, that's really sweet. I don't know who that was, but thank you, fat person. But seriously, like talking about collaboration, right? Collaboration, it's something that I experienced in my very first foray into the video game music community in 2015. And it really is the thing that I like treasure the most about this community is how many people are, or not how many people, but the willingness of people to jump in together and make something amazing. Because it's fun to make music on your own and do solo tracks. That's fine. That has its place and whatnot. But when you get a bunch of people together in like completely different parts of the world, recording these things and coming together and making this finished track or album or whatever, right? It's just amazing. Right? And it's amazing. I think it's really amazing when you do an arrangement and you're sitting there and you're listening to these, you're listening to your computer like struggle to make these like with these samples, and it doesn't sound good. It sounds really stiff and whatnot. And then a bunch of people take it and record it, and every person is going to do something a little differently. Like nobody's out there to play like a robot. So each person is going to add their own sense of like who they are into the track. Maybe they embellish this or change up that or something. But when you put it all together, it just makes something incredible. It just absolutely brings it to life. And that is what I live for. And that's something that I found in the video game music community that I haven't found anywhere else. Like just this willingness to record for each other and collaborate and really make these things come to life. And I think that's the really powerful aspect of the VGM community. So I like that you bring up the concept of collaboration, because I really think that that is a fundamental, central part of what we do.
I think the most quintessential example I can think of, you were a part of this year's and last year's VGM together, but last year you were a part of the Paper Mario Line Them Up performance, which had like 150 different musicians or something. But I'd love to know. That's an amazing piece. I've said it on the show before. Everyone should check that out if they haven't. But, can you tell us what it was like to be picked for that? How did you get involved? And then when you saw it and saw what you were a part of, like what it felt like?
Oh, yeah. So I believe, I don't remember if Doug or Laura contacted me initially, but I got an email from one of them saying that they were putting this thing together. Were you interested in being a part of it? If so, you'd get contacted by somebody later about what your part would be. And of course I said yes, because it sounded awesome. I think the idea of like what VGM together would eventually become hadn't really coalesced at that point. So I think it was just this idea of this kind of long collaborative piece. But a while later, I mean, it took a while, but I got an email from Thomas Kresge, who, if you don't know Thomas, he's like one of the arrangers and producers for the Game Brass, which is a phenomenal group.
Who you've also collaborated with?
Yeah, I got to play the Irish tenor banjo on their Outer Wilds cover on Brass Effect. But I mean, absolutely amazing brass quintet, really cool people. But Thomas Kresge is like really involved with them as like I think a producer or arranger. But anyway, he sent me an email and said, here's the piece I'm doing. And are you willing to, can you play acoustic guitar? Here's the sheet music, blah, 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 backing track and click and whatnot. I was super on board. There was like some, some filming instructions and stuff. So I filmed all of that, not really knowing too much about how it was going to be used or how it would show up, but all I knew it was going to be this thing, right? And it was more exciting that way, like not really knowing. And then, everyone watched. I found a bunch of good friends of mine who were also involved. And of course it was like, don't tell anyone about this and whatnot. So it was kind of a surprise to see the other people. I was like my very good friend and longtime collaborator, Darby Cupid, had like a pretty big singing part in it, and just like it was exciting to see all of that come together, and then to see the people you were like performing with, right, was also really exciting. So that sort of excitement was what really got me. It was a really incredible project. I know Laura and Trivia worked like super hard on that. Of Laura of Disco Cactus, which is another fantastic band that everyone should listen to. But yeah, I think it was really fun, and I was just really honored to be a part of it, and to be asked to play on that, because it's it became a big deal, and a lot of incredibly talented people. I didn't know I'd be playing guitar opposite Darren Korb, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I was like, oh man, that's that's really fun. I'm a big fan of Darren Korb's music. So
it really is like an exceptional piece. Like the videography, the music, it's so good. Once again, if people have not seen Line Them Up, the Paper Mario thing from VGM Together 2021, you absolutely have to watch it in its entirety.
Yeah, it's really cool. And watch this. I wasn't in this year's showcase, but this year's showcase was also excellent. So, and I think everything from VGM Together is now up on their YouTube channel. So yes. If you get a chance, check it out. And if they have it again, I don't know if they're having it again, right? But if they have it again, like, that is definitely like a must-do event. It's like, for me, it was like the event of the year. Sort of, there was VGM Con earlier, which was a lot of fun. And then there's VGM Together, so they kind of are half the year apart. And so that's really cool. I really like that, so I can have something to look forward to and work towards. And then, I have some time to get prepared for the next thing. But, knowing that there's going to be this sort of like immersive, complete weekend event happening, it's nice.
Can you tell us about your time in the Jumpmen, an a cappella group at UCLA in 2005, I believe? Yeah.
So we started, so I was a freshman at UCLA in 2004. And there was a guy, I was in chorale and chamber singers at UCLA. I did that all 4 years, both of them, some of the, like, totally justified my, like, why did I pick UCLA over some other, university, right? Or totally justified, incredible experience. But there was somebody in there with a bunch of Mario pins on his backpack, and I was starting to put pins on my backpack too. So I just taught, he was also, we were both tenors. I talked to him, and he was super into video game music like I was. His name is Jeff Moore. He was a composition major. He was a year ahead of me. And he and his friend Hannibal, who was also in chorale and chamber singers, were thinking of forming this kind of video game music a cappella group because he had recently done an arrangement of some of the music from the original Super Mario Brothers. So we got together and started doing that. I think I don't remember if it was Jeff or Hannibal, but they met somebody on their dorm floor who wanted to be the fourth person, this guy, Jimmy. And we started practicing. I remember, I think it was Jeff's dorm room, but it was done up like like a Mondrian painting. Someone had used like electrical tape and like construction paper or something and made it look like that. But we used to gather in there and practice this thing. And there's this long standing tradition at UCLA of something called Spring Sing. And every year, basically, all of these different groups audition, and, they go through and they coach you through your act if you're selected. So we audition kind of like on a whim, right? Because I don't know, there are all these a cappella groups on campus that have existed for years and years and years, and we're very good, right? But we were like, it's worth a shot, and they actually took us. So we were kind of, I should say I was a bit surprised because I wasn't sure how that would be received, right? But they kind of coached us, the Spring Sing people coached us through this whole thing, getting an act together and everything. And then we performed, and we actually, I think it was called the Judges Choice Award or something, but we won something at Spring Sing in 2005. And then after that, Jimmy left because he wasn't actually that into video games. I don't think he was that into it. But we got another friend of ours from chorale and chamber singers and just the general kind of music community at UCLA, another composition major named Sean Fryer, who's actually quite prolific these days in terms of composition. But we got him as our fourth member, and we sang basically until the three of them graduated in 2007. So I was always a year younger than those guys. But it was a really incredible experience. We only did like 3 things. We did the Super Mario Brothers medley. We did a Legend of Zelda thing, again from the original NES release. And then we also did Dr. Wily Stage 1 from Mega Man 2, which is, I realize these days is like everyone does that, right? But I guess in like 2005 or 6, it was novel at that point. But yeah, we didn't do that much, but it was a lot of fun. And those guys became like good friends of mine. I haven't kept in contact with them, sadly, but I'd love to see what they're up to. It was really a lot of fun.
Is there ever going to be like a rooftop Beatles reunion thing?
I don't know where any of them are. Well, I know, as I said, Sean Fryer is like a pretty prolific composer these days of serious music, right? Who gets his pieces performed and stuff. So I don't know. In terms of Jeff and Hannibal, I don't really know how to contact them, to be completely honest. But it would be really cool to go back and record with them and put them out, especially now that there's so much infrastructure available for releasing video game music covers on the internet, right? Like back then, there's no like Sound Drop or Louder or, all of these things that we have now, right? There wasn't even YouTube in 2005, like, I think. Or maybe it was just starting, but like, there weren't all of these things that we just have instant access to now. It is so easy. If I want to sit down, I could write I could cover something in like 30 minutes and submit it to Sounddrop, and it would be on its way to like Spotify and Apple Music and stuff in like a week or two, right? But back then you couldn't do that. So it would be cool to like get together with them and actually, sing through these things, record ourselves, maybe put something out, right? Because I really wish we had had access to this, this plethora of technological stuff that we use now to record each other and do these collaborations and whatnot, because we could have put something out back then. But, I think I have a couple of cell phone videos. I have the original recording. And you know what? I honestly forgot to mention this, but back in the day, I think it was 2006 or so, maybe 2007, there was somebody was putting together a pilot for a new show. I think it was called Geek Out. Yes. On G4.
Yeah.
And they asked us to sing, and they actually brought us in there, and we filmed some. I don't remember which song we filmed, but we filmed something.
This footage presumably could be out there.
Well, I do have it on a DVD somewhere. I mean, I need to, somewhere being the operative word. I'd have to find it, but I have it somewhere. I don't know if I'm legally allowed to, shove it out there. I did have our video from Spring Sing 2005 online for a while, and it got taken down.
Really?
Which is... Yeah, it got taken.
Like
this is a
Nintendo thing, or because of Springs?
I think it. I don't know.
Huh.
I'm not sure, but it was taken down years ago. Like 2009 or something. So right. It hasn't been up for a while, but it's out there. I have the file saved on like 3 computers ago, and I am pretty meticulous about backing everything up a gazillion times, so I'm sure I could access it if I really wanted to, but I don't think it would produce a recording that would be something I could submit. Also, if it was somehow flagged for some sort of violation back then, I don't think that would have lapsed now. Although with licensing, maybe Sounddrop could do something. They're pretty amazing. But yeah, no, the Jumpmen was really fun. So yeah, I guess while 2015 was the first time I got involved in the video game music community, it was not the first time I did anything with video game music in terms of arrangement. So, and in fact, that was something I was kind of doing all through high school as well, but not on any sort of serious level, and nothing that I would want to release now, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. You mentioned earlier you did most of your gaming in the 90s, and I know you've said before as well, your gaming time has gone down since you started playing more VGM because you're busy doing the VGM. That makes me wonder, do you obviously there's a focus on retro gaming music for what you do, but I wonder, is that out of necessity? You don't really play the new ones, so...
I also just don't keep up, which is entirely my own fault. I've played, in terms of new games, games that have come out in the past 10 years, which I realize is not everyone's definition of new, but I'll use it here, right? I have played a few indie games, obviously Delta Rune, Chapters 1 and 2, Undertale, some other stuff like Crawl, right? A couple of party games like Duck Game. I don't know if Jackbox qualifies as indie, but certainly the Jackbox games. But I've done some covers of that with some friends that I've had a lot of fun with. But, other than sort of casual gaming, I've just spent more time playing music, and it really, and it's not like I don't find gaming fun, because I really do enjoy gaming, but there's also something very relaxing and fun about just sitting there and playing an instrument or just trying something new or playing along with a recording, right? I really enjoy doing that sort of stuff as well. In addition to gaming, I'm actually going through Final Fantasy X-2 for the first time in, 20 years, 19, 20 years now. I'm almost done with it, but I've kind of casually been working through the classics that I grew up with that are now being remastered. So there is that. And that's, a friend gave me a Switch a couple of years ago. He's kind of like one of those guys who takes broken tech that seems completely beyond repair and fixes it. So he somehow got a hold of this Switch and he fixed it up and mailed it to me. And I've been playing, I played FF8, FF10, the Romancing Saga 2 and 3, Chrono Cross. I've played all in that, but the previous last console I owned was a PS3, and I didn't even play any games on that. I got it to play Kingdom Hearts 3 when it eventually came out, and we all know what happened with that. So the PS3 was basically just a glorified Blu-ray player for me, but I did get a fair amount of use out of the PS2 for things like FF10, FF10-2, the two Kingdom Hearts that came out on it, and stuff. But I sort of petered out after that point. I'm not, admittedly, as into the action RPGs, and when Final Fantasy kind of pivoted in that direction, I kind of stopped playing.
I'm actually similar. I have the FF7 remake, but haven't even turned it on yet. It's not quite my thing.
Oh yeah, no, I can understand that. I've watched my friend Darby play it. He streams it sometimes. And because I already played the original, it's not really spoiling anything for me, right? I already know the story, so it's fun to watch and play it sometimes. But I just feel like that level of coordination and just the pace of the game is just not as much my thing. I totally understand what you're saying.
So, unless I'm wrong, it sounds like you said, you haven't really kept up on games, but you kind of keep up on game soundtracks. So it sounds like there's a number of game soundtracks that you've listened to for games that you have never played.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I just finished. I've listened to now a few times through the complete soundtrack of the game that came out called Harvestella. I hadn't even heard of it, and I was watching Samantha Ballard, who's an amazing harp player, play on Bonus Stage Ultimate a couple of weekends ago, or last weekend, whenever that was. But she mentioned Harvestella, and I was like, oh, I gotta check that out. So I've been listening to that soundtrack. Octopath Traveler is something I need to play at some point. That's something I feel like I would really enjoy playing. But I've listened to that soundtrack dozens of times all the way through. Absolutely loved it. Never touched the game.
That's a perfect example then of, I'm wondering, like, Octopath Traveler sounds like you really want to play it. Do you think it's a spoiler at all to know the soundtrack so well?
No, although that you bring up a really interesting point. For me, it's not a spoiler to hear the soundtrack beforehand. And I was actually talking to a collaborator, and we were talking about songs we could cover, right? And I suggested something, and she said, "Oh, I haven't actually. What is that from?" It was a track from Hades. Again, like another soundtrack. I've listened to the Hades soundtrack I don't know how many times. I've never played the game. I've never even seen the game being played, but I love that soundtrack. But I mentioned to her that, oh, we should, I think this would be a fun one to cover. And she was like, oh, that's kind of spoilery. And I felt awful, right? Because it didn't occur to me that, listening to the music would be a spoiler, right? But for some people it is, and that's perfectly fine. For me, it's not, personally. That has never really fazed me. Like, for example, I experienced the Romancing Saga games as a kid in the 90s through their soundtracks. I just bought their soundtracks because going back to the whole Japanese bookstore and Japanese CD store, right? I could get the soundtracks, and I actually did get the games. They were never released in the States. I had a modded SNES because you just break out those tabs and the Super Famicom games go right in. And they're hard. They're hard if you're like an 8-year-old kid who kind of sort of knows a bit of Japanese, but not too much, right? So, I never really was able to fully comprehend those games, but I experienced them more as soundtracks. And then as an adult, I actually was able to go through and play the games and kind of match up the pieces to the scenes. But just in terms of spoilers, I didn't feel like those games were spoiled for me. Just because I had heard the final boss music didn't mean that the final boss seemed any less surprising to me, other than now I could sing along with it, right? Like as I was, as it was completely destroying me, because those games are really hard. But, I really like listening to the soundtracks. I'm not super worried about stuff. Obviously, if there are lyrics in some track that spoil something, then that's going to be a problem. But, given the nature of just songs in video games, like vocal tracks in video games, they usually don't give away that much. If I listen to Steki Dane from Final Fantasy X, which is let's say 3/4 of the way through that game, I don't feel like the lyrics spoil the plot, nor does that change the impact, because that happens in a very important, impactful scene in the story. I don't feel like it spoiled that impact for me. And that was a game where I did listen to the soundtrack all the way through before I played it. I was actually in Japan for the release of the Final Fantasy X soundtrack, and I bought it on release day. and absolutely devoured it, obviously. And then the game came out in the US later and I played it. But I feel like even for like that, for that song, right, even though it has words, it didn't really spoil what it was for me in the end.
On a somewhat related note, you have made a soundtrack for a game that doesn't exist, The Deer in the Moon. And I'm wondering, is there a difference when you're creating something like that? Like, obviously, you can make a concept album or even a regular album. You're telling a story with your music. There's a difference between telling a story with your music like that or telling the story of a game, you know, with the music. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and for that, so that was done, and the other one that I have up there, Story of Seasons, and one that's going to come out shortly called Monster in the Observatory. Those were done for game soundtrack jams, and so like the kind of assignment was to make a game soundtrack in a very short period, just a few days, right? That's sort of complete. So I kind of approached that, you know, from I'm going to think of my favorite, and in this case, like thinking back on those 90s games, Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, Chrono Trigger, the 3 romancing sagas, right? Those sorts of things that I grew up with and loved. You know, I tried to fit that on top of that. So I'm like, okay, I want like an intro, right? I want a creepy forest, a cave, and everything. And because you're not really creating for a specific image that you have in mind, you're just sort of, you're kind of just, you're not able to see anything. There's no artwork other than that cover art that they give you, right? You're like, really, I'm just kind of envisioning different scenes from games I've already played, and trying to come up with something based on that. So it's like a really different exercise. I'm actually working on a couple of different game soundtracks now for real games that will hopefully come out at some point. And one of them I can see, right? One of them has a playable demo and the other one just has some concept art. So it's like a very different, it's a very different experience trying to come up with music when you can see something or not. But I think in terms of those like those conceptual game albums, those are just sort of me kind of envisioning, you know, if I close my eyes and I picture, you know, like some scene from like Secret of Mana or something like that, you know, and then I like try to write something on top of that while ignoring the fact that I know like what that scene is quote unquote supposed to sound like, right? Because I've heard, you know, I've listened to the soundtrack, I've played these games. But that's sort of what I'm doing there. But it is a different experience from when you like actually have a playable demo and you can just say, okay, this music lines up like this here, especially if it's timed, right? Which doesn't, nothing I've worked on has really been timed too much, you know, where I have to actually hit like specific timing marks with the music. But, you know, just having that playable demo makes it a lot easier in a way, because you can just, you know, I can actually open up the demo on the computer and then start playing the track and be like, okay, does this fit in this scene, right? Like if I'm looking like, you know, I can't really talk about them, but like if I'm looking at a scene in a game, right, I can play that track and be like, does this fit with my idea of what what I'm trying to do, or does this sound like really out of place and weird, you know? So
right, we're pretty much winding down, but I did want to ask, as a ethnomusicologist and music historian, where does video game music fall in music history? Like, is it its own genre, or are video games a medium for many genres?
Well, I think, you know, that's kind of hard, right? And I think looking back at those arrangement albums, we can kind of take a look at that and kind of like the video game music scene in general, right? Because we are all taking our own stylistic concepts and ideas and pulling from different cultures and superimposing them on top of, existing video game tracks. So I'm not really sure if we can say, ooh, it's hard. It's hard. It's a really tough question. There is an emerging discipline called ludomusicology that deals specifically with music in games. So that's something I'm kind of actively trying to get into at the moment, because I do miss academia. I haven't done really anything academic since 2013, and I do miss it. And like watching some of these ludomusicology conferences online has really kind of whet my appetite for that again. But I think it's really hard to say, because a lot of I think really some of the articles that I have read, and then just sort of adding my own thoughts on top of that, always highlight the fact that video game music started in a certain place because of technological limitations. So the way that it sounded, particularly in like the 8-bit era, right? A lot of that has to do with the technical limitations of the systems that are playing back that music. So the music, it has to be crafted in to fit that. So we kind of come back to this. It's this weird, like, it's not a chicken and the egg situation really, but it's just sort of like kind of trying to conceive of, if there weren't technological limitations in the beginning, right? How would that have changed video game music? I mean, I have no doubt that it would have been different, right? But I think that looking at those and considering those technical limitations can really help us to kind of grasp, like, what is this, like, is game music its own genre on itself, or is it something that we kind of put other genres or musical cultures on top of? Like an example of that is Yasunori Mitsuda getting into Irish traditional music, and really taking a lot of concepts of that from that culture and injecting it into soundtracks for like Xenogears, right, is I think where it first really shows up for him, and Chrono Cross. And then on, I think there's a game called something like Shugunai or something like that. But again, a game I've never played, but I've listened to death the soundtrack. But he really takes those concepts and uses them there. So, I mean, he's not Irish and the music isn't traditional because he's writing it himself, right? But is that music somehow connected to our larger concept of what Irish music is? I don't know. It's kind of a hard question to answer. But I think there is something there that's worth exploring, that maybe all game music is not the same. We've seen now a lot of game soundtracks sort of in what I'm just going to call the modern era, which, kind of like modern current consoles, right? A lot of it is very driven by the symphony orchestra, driven by actual recording sessions of an actual orchestra. Right. So is that distinct from sort of like what people have been doing with movie music, or is it a continuation of that? How are those connected to the Western classical tradition that has been a major thing in, just broadly use like the West, like Europe and sort of its branches, right, for the past few hundred years, right? So are those connected to that? Are they something different? It just is really, it's a really big question. But for me, I tend to think back to, so when you submit to things like Sound Drop, right? And say if you're not aware, Sound Drop is a music licensing and distribution service that I'm just going to go ahead and say that most VGM people use. I don't know if most, but it seems like it. I use it. Most of my friends, in fact, pretty much everyone I've collaborated with uses it. And when you go to select genre, they have so many different choices. They have like probably well over 100 choices that get really into like really specific subgenres of stuff. But there isn't a video game genre, right? And I think that's really telling, because I think they're, and I don't know if this is a conscious decision on their part or just a consequence of what is happening. I mean, they know that a major part of their audience is the video game, or not their audience, but their clientele is the video game music community. So are they inviting video game music or video game music musicians to delve deeper into the actual music itself to try to pick out what genre it really belongs to, or or is it something else, right? It could also be dictated by like market forces, what other music services like Spotify or Apple Music, Tidal, whatever else is out there, kind of go to. But I think at least for me, like selecting for a genre, if I'm going to select genre, if video game music were there, that would just be sort of like the easy cop out, right, for me. But if instead, because it doesn't exist, it invites me to really think about this music. Like, what am I accessing when I either write or arrange this music for the instruments I have picked, in the style I have chosen? What does it mean to me, and how is that represented in this recording? So I think that's really powerful in a way. And, maybe we shouldn't think of video game music in the same way that we think of like, this is video game music. Well, what does that really mean? Right? Like, it's music in a video game, right? But that doesn't really tell us anything about what it's doing sonically, or how it functions, or what, really anything other than it is or was used in a video game. So I think that's telling as well. Just that maybe it's a category, but not really a genre of music. Cool. If that makes sense. Yeah. Sorry, that was
absolutely.
Really long answer, but that's something, it's something I've thought about a lot. And I think that a lot of people, like a lot of scholars today, who are involved in the field of ludomusicology, are working on those sorts of questions, right? Like, how do we consider music? Like, how do we consider the genre of video game music? And it seems like something that's, it's like, okay, like whatever, but it really is fascinating. Like, this is the sort of stuff that really gets me going, and really like excites me. And I love hearing about this kind of stuff, how we access different genres in video game music, and what is it really? Like, what is it? It has changed so much since, like, even the 90s, right? Which I consider sort of to be my video game heyday, right? But it has changed so much since that time. Like, so what is it? Right? I'd love to hear your opinion and what you think about that, because I'm fascinated now, especially since you brought that up, right?
Honestly,
Like,
I don't know that I would have had an answer until I heard your answer there. And I was thinking as you were talking two things. One of your final points there. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, if you say, "Oh, it's video game music," well, what? Okay, that tells me nothing. Like, it's a pretty broad thing to say. But the other is, I kind of realized, like, if you were to say video game music, I guess my head, despite the fact that we're, 15, 20 years into much more than this, my head would go to chiptune. I would think, like, 8-bit, 16-bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I actually should check. I think they do on Sounddrop have a category for chiptune. But see, that's something where if I see chiptune, right, I know... I don't know exactly what it's going to be like sonically, but I can know what to expect from it. We're going to be hearing some square waves, some triangle waves, that noise channel, right? We're going to be hearing those sorts of sounds. It's going to bring us back to like that NES, the Game Boy, right? Whether that's mixed with like something else like a drum machine, right? Or a rock band, or simply on its own, right? We can know what to expect sonically from that label, from the chiptune label or chip music. I mean, I know there's so many like subgenres, right? And different ways that, there's 8-bit music and all chip rock and all sorts of stuff, right? But we know kind of generally what to expect. But with video game music, I don't know that that's so clear unless we're talking about a certain era, right? And so I think that's also interesting. I feel like we, as people, or at least I shouldn't speak for all people, but at least for me, when I think of genre, I think of sounds. I think of a mix of different timbres of instruments, or instruments including the voice, and all of these, like how the music is arranged, like what patterns to expect, or what sort of overall organization is involved. But I'm not sure if I can make those statements with video game music. And it would be interesting because I'm sure there are people out there who are studying this right now. So it would be interesting to hear somebody who's really tried to dissect like what that means. What does video game music mean, other than the like it's music that is used in a video game, which is sort of like the obvious answer. But yeah, that's sort of my thought on it, right? It's hard for me to answer that. I also feel like I'm probably not qualified. As somebody who has only begun my journey into game music scholarship, right? I feel like I'm also sort of not qualified to answer that. But I feel like there are a lot of people who have really put a lot of effort into trying to delve into just what that means, and that's really exciting to me. I'm actually in February. I've got a it's an online thing for NOCVIGM, the North American conference for video game music, which I'm really excited to watch all of those papers and see what people have to say. But I feel like there will be a lot of discussion of those sorts of topics at something like that. So if you are interested in that, I would really recommend watch. It's online. So
cool. Thank you. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, I'm super looking forward to that. I love the like video game music conventions. Like VGM Con had some awesome online programming. Obviously, VGM Together. I can't say enough good things about VGM Together. But it's really cool to also watch like an academic perspective on video game music. So I think that there are a lot of cool events out there, and I'm just super excited that we are now in an era where we have all of these things, right? Because even 10 years ago, this totally wasn't There was MagFest 10 years ago, and I don't even think there was VGMCon at that point. So, I mean, I'm so lucky to be active in video game music at this point in history.
We lost the Nintendo hotline, but look at what we've gained.
Right, yeah. Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's an amazing community, and I'm just so thankful to be a part of all of this.
Well, people can check out Ian Martyn at your link tree is /Ian Martyn. That's linktr.ee/Ian IANMARTYN. Anywhere else people can check you out?
Well, it's just all of the streaming services. Just search for Ian Martyn. I'll come up. You can tell it's the same picture everywhere. And also my Bandcamp. I can't put any of the video game music covers on Bandcamp, but any sort of original or public domain music I do is up there, ianmartyn.bandcamp.com. And then certainly like all of the different labels or communities that I'm part of that do put music up online, like Game Grooves, right, or Pixel Mixers. You can usually find some tracks of mine on those things.
Ian Martyn, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.